The glint of metal in my headlights was all it took to change my life forever. One second I was cruising down a lonely stretch of highway, and the next I was hurtling towards a nightmare that would haunt me for years to come. It was just past midnight, and I was on hour 14 of what should have been a 12-hour drive. The last dregs of my gas station coffee had gone cold hours ago, and the radio had long since faded to static. It was just me, my old Civic, and miles of empty asphalt stretching out ahead. I'd taken this route dozens of times before, a winding backroad shortcut that shaved a good hour off my trip home. But tonight, something felt off. Maybe it was the way the moonlight cast strange shadows across the road, or how the wind whistled through the trees like a warning. Whatever it was, it had the hairs on the back of my neck standing at attention. That's when I saw it. A car pulled over on the shoulder about a quarter mile ahead. As I got closer, I could make out more details. It was an older model sedan, its hazard lights blinking weakly in the darkness. I slowed down, squinting through my windshield to see if I could spot the driver. Now, I'm not the type to stop for every stranded motorist I come across. Call me paranoid, but you hear too many horror stories these days. Still, something about this scene tugged at my conscience. It was the middle of nowhere, past midnight, and cell service out here was spotty at best. If that were me broken down out here, I'd be praying for someone, anyone, to stop. Before I could talk myself out of it, I was pulling onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under my tires as I came to a stop about 20 feet behind the other car. I left my engine running and my headlights on, illuminating the scene in front of me. "Hello?" I called out, rolling down my window just a crack. "You folks need any help?" Silence. I peered through the darkness, trying to make out any movement inside the other vehicle. Nothing. The car sat there, engine off, hazards blinking, but no sign of life. A chill ran down my spine. Something wasn't right here. I should have listened to that little voice in my head screaming at me to get the hell out of there. But curiosity, or maybe just plain stupidity, got the better of me. I grabbed my phone, no service of course, and the small flashlight I keep in my glove compartment, then slowly opened my door. The night air hit me like a slap to the face, damp and heavy with the smell of pine and something else. Something metallic. My footsteps crunched loudly in the silence as I approached the abandoned vehicle. "Hello?" I called out again, sweeping my flashlight beam across the area. "Anyone here?" As I got closer, I noticed the driver's side door was slightly ajar. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached out to pull it open further. The interior of the car was empty, but signs of a struggle were evident. The steering wheel was smeared with what looked horribly like blood, and shards of glass from the shattered passenger window littered the seats. "Jesus Christ," I muttered, stumbling backward. I needed to get out of here, needed to call the cops, needed to... A twig snapped in the woods to my right. I whirled around, flashlight beam dancing wildly across the tree line. "Who's there?" My voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Another snap, closer this time. Fight-or-flight instinct kicked in, and I bolted for my car. I was maybe 10 feet away when something burst from the underbrush, a dark shape hurtling towards me with inhuman speed. I didn't even have time to scream before it slammed into me, sending us both crashing to the ground. My flashlight went flying, its beams spinning crazily before disappearing into the tall grass. The thing on top of me was heavy, reeking of sweat and something far worse. I thrashed wildly, managing to land an elbow to what I hoped was its face. It let out a grunt, a human sound that somehow made this whole situation even more terrifying, and its grip loosened just enough for me to scramble away. I half ran, half crawled towards my car, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear it right behind me, twigs and leaves crunching under its feet as it gave chase. Just as my fingers grazed the door handle of my Civic, a hand clamped down on my ankle, yanking me backward. I went down hard, chin smacking against the gravel. The taste of blood filled my mouth as I was dragged away from safety, away from escape, away from everything I knew and loved. "No!" I screamed, fingers clawing at the ground. "Please, God, no!" My attacker flipped me over, and for the first time I got a good look at my would-be killer. It was a man, or at least it had been at some point. His face was a mess of scars and poorly healed wounds, his eyes wild and unfocused. He grinned down at me, revealing a mouthful of broken, yellowed teeth. "Caught me another one," he rasped, his voice like gravel in a blender. "Boss'll be pleased." Before I could process what he meant by another one, he raised something above his head. A rock, I realized with horror. I threw my arms up in a pathetic attempt to shield myself, squeezing my eyes shut and waiting for the blow. It never came. Instead, there was a dull thud, followed by the weight on top of me suddenly disappearing. My eyes flew open just in time to see my attacker crumple to the ground, revealing a figure standing behind him. For a split second, I thought I was hallucinating. The newcomer was a woman, probably in her mid-50s, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. She was dressed like she'd just come from a PTA meeting, sensible slacks, a cardigan, and practical shoes. In her hands, she held what looked like a tire iron. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked, her tone so casual we could have been chatting in line at the grocery store. I gaped at her, struggling to find words. Who are you?" She tisked, shaking her head. "No time for introductions now. We need to get you out of here before the others show up." "Others?" I echoed weakly. As if on cue, a chorus of shouts erupted from the woods. The woman's eyes widened, and she reached down to haul me to my feet with surprising strength. "Your car," she said urgently. "Keys?" I fumbled in my pocket, producing my key fob with shaking hands. She snatched it from me and all but shoved me towards the passenger side of my Civic. "Get in," she ordered, "and keep your head down." I didn't need to be told twice. I dove into the car, ducking down in the seat as the woman slid behind the wheel. The engine roared to life, and we peeled out onto the highway in a spray of gravel. I risked a glance out the rear window. Several dark shapes had emerged from the woods, gathering around the fallen body of my attacker. One of them looked up, and even from this distance I could see the fury in its eyes. It raised an arm, pointing at our retreating taillights. "Oh God," I whimpered, sliding down further in my seat. "Oh God, oh God, oh God." "Calm down," the woman said, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. She was pushing my poor old Civic to speeds I didn't even know it was capable of. "We're not out of the woods yet, literally or figuratively." I turned to stare at her, a hysterical laugh bubbling up in my throat. "Who are you? What the hell is going on?" she sighed, looking every bit like a disappointed schoolteacher. "My name is Margaret. And what's going on, my dear, is that you very nearly became the latest victim in a string of disappearances that's been plaguing this stretch of highway for the past 6 months. I shook my head, trying to make sense of her words. "Disappearances? You mean there have been others?" Margaret nodded grimly. 17 that we know of. All of them fell for the same trap. An abandoned car on the side of the road, a good Samaritan stopping to help, and then... She trailed off. But I could fill in the blanks well enough. "But how do you know all this?" I asked. "And why were you out there tonight?" She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was heavy with emotion. "My daughter, Emily, was one of the first to go missing. The police, they didn't do enough. Said she probably just ran off, that there wasn't any evidence of foul play. But I knew my Emily. She wouldn't have just disappeared like that." Margaret's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "So I started digging, found other families with similar stories. We formed a group, started patrolling the area ourselves, and tonight, I got lucky." I let out a shaky breath, slumping back in my seat. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, leaving me feeling hollow and drained. "So what happens now?" "Now," Margaret said, a hint of steel in her voice, "we go to the police. We've got you as a witness, physical evidence of an attack. And if we're very lucky, they manage to subdue that bastard I hit with the tire iron. It's more than we've ever had before." I nodded slowly, my mind still reeling from everything that had happened. Part of me wanted nothing more than to go home, crawl into bed, and pretend this had all been a horrible nightmare. But I knew I couldn't do that. Not when there were other victims out there, other families searching for answers. "I'll help," I heard myself say. "Whatever you need, statements, testimony, anything, I'll do it." Margaret glanced over at me, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I had a feeling you might say that. You've got guts, kid. Stupid, maybe, for stopping in the first place, but guts nonetheless." I let out a weak chuckle. "Yeah, well, let's hope those guts don't get me killed next time." "Oh, trust me," Margaret said, her eyes glinting with a fierce determination. "After tonight, there won't be a next time. We're going to end this, once and for all." As we sped through the night towards whatever came next, I couldn't help but feel a spark of hope. The road ahead was dark and uncertain, but at least now I wasn't facing it alone. The neon sign flickered like a dying heartbeat, casting an eerie glow across the empty parking lot. I should have known better than to stop, but with my gas gauge hovering dangerously close to empty and the next town over 50 miles away, I didn't have much of a choice. Little did I know my desperate pit stop was about to become a nightmare I'd never forget. It was just past 2 a.m. and I'd been on the road for nearly 18 hours straight. My eyes felt like they were full of sand, and the last dregs of my energy drink had worn off somewhere around midnight. But I was determined to make it home by morning no matter what. The gas station appeared like a mirage on the horizon, a tiny oasis of light in the vast desert of darkness. As I pulled off the highway, the gravel crunching under my tires seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness of the night. I eased my beat-up Corolla up to the pump, the sputtering of my engine a reminder of just how close I'd cut it. The place looked deserted, not surprising given the hour, but a faded "Open 24 hours" sign in the window of the small convenience store gave me hope. Stepping out of the car, I was hit by a wave of cold air that made me shiver despite my heavy jacket. The wind whistled through the nearby Joshua trees, their twisted forms casting bizarre shadows in the harsh fluorescent lighting. As I reached for the pump, something made me pause. Maybe it was the way the air seemed to thicken suddenly, or how the silence felt almost expectant. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone watching me from the shadows, but there was nothing, just miles of empty desert in every direction. Shaking off the feeling, I focused on filling up my tank. The numbers on the pump's display ticked up slowly, each gallon pushing my meager budget to its limit. I was so focused on watching the dollars climb that I almost missed the movement in my peripheral vision. My head snapped up, eyes scanning the darkness beyond the pool of light surrounding the gas station. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw something, a figure hunched and misshapen dart between two of the Joshua trees. But when I blinked, it was gone. "Get it together," I muttered to myself, rubbing my tired eyes. "You're just seeing things." The pump clicked off, startling me out of my thoughts. I replaced the nozzle with shaky hands, trying to convince myself that it was just fatigue playing tricks on me. But as I turned towards the store to pay, that feeling of being watched intensified. The bell above the door jangled discordantly as I stepped inside, the sound echoing in the empty store. The interior was like any other gas station convenience store I'd ever been in. Rows of snacks and drinks, a sad-looking hot dog roller, and a bored-looking clerk behind the counter. Except the clerk wasn't there. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. No response. I made my way to the counter, eyes darting around for any sign of movement. A half-empty cup of coffee sat next to the register, wisps of steam still rising from its surface. Whoever had been here had left in a hurry. That's when I noticed the smell. At first I thought it was just the usual gas station aroma, a mix of stale coffee and cleaning products. But underneath that was something else, something rotten. My stomach churned as I realized the smell was getting stronger. It seemed to be coming from the back of the store, behind a door marked "Employees Only." Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave, to get in my car and drive as fast and as far as I could. But I couldn't just leave without paying. And what if the clerk was hurt back there? I'd never forgive myself if I left someone in trouble. Swallowing hard, I made my way around the counter. The smell was almost overpowering now, a miasma of decay that made my eyes water. My hand trembled as I reached for the door handle. I had just started to turn it when a sound froze me in place. It was coming from outside, a low, guttural moan that was decidedly inhuman. I spun around, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Through the store's large front windows, I could see shapes moving in the darkness. They were humanoid, but wrong. Their movements were jerky and uncoordinated, like puppets with half their strings cut. As they shambled into the light, I had to clamp a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. Their skin was a sickly gray, hanging off their bones in rotting strips. Empty eye sockets stared blindly ahead, and their mouths gaped open, revealing blackened teeth and swollen tongues. They were headed straight for the store. Panic overrode any remaining caution I had. I bolted for the back door, no longer caring what I might find on the other side. Anything was better than those things. I burst through the door and found myself in a small storage room. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with boxes and supplies. And there, huddled in the corner, was the missing clerk. He was young, probably barely out of his teens, and his face was a mask of terror. When he saw me, he let out a whimper. "What are those things?" I gasped, trying to catch my breath. He shook his head, eyes wide. "I don't know. They just showed up out of nowhere. Started banging on the windows, trying to get in. I've never seen anything like it." A loud crash from the front of the store cut off any further explanation. They were inside. "Is there another way out of here?" I asked urgently. The clerk nodded, pointing to a door on the far side of the room. "Fire exit. It'll set off an alarm, but I think that's the least of our worries right now," I said, already moving towards it. We had just reached the door when the storage room door burst open. 3 of the creatures stumbled in, their unseeing eyes somehow finding us unerringly. I shoved the fire exit open, triggering a shrill alarm that pierced the night air. The clerk and I tumbled out into the cool desert night, the stars above a stark contrast to the horror we'd just witnessed. "My car," I said, pointing to where my Corolla sat by the pump. "We need to—" My words died in my throat as I took in the scene before us. While we'd been inside, more of the creatures had arrived. At least a dozen of them now milled around the parking lot, effectively cutting us off from my vehicle. "Oh God," the clerk moaned beside me. "We're trapped." I grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at me. "No, we're not. We just need to think." My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. The creatures were slow, but there were so many of them. If we could just create a distraction. That's when I spotted it. An old pickup truck parked on the far side of the lot, partially hidden behind a dumpster. If we could reach it, we might have a chance. I explained my plan to the clerk in hushed tones, all too aware of the shuffling sounds growing closer as the creatures investigated the alarm. "On 3, I whispered. 1, 2, 3. We took off running, our footsteps echoing in the night. Immediately, the air was filled with those terrible moans as the creatures spotted us. My lungs burned as we sprinted across the lot, dodging grasping hands and gnashing teeth. We were almost to the truck when I heard a cry behind me. The clerk had tripped, sprawling across the asphalt. I skidded to a stop, torn between self-preservation and the need to help. In that moment of hesitation, the creatures closed in. Time seemed to slow down as I watched them descend on the fallen clerk. His screams would haunt me for years to come. Bile rose in my throat, but I forced myself to turn away. There was nothing I could do for him now. I had to survive, to warn others about what was happening here. I reached the truck, yanking open the door and scrambling inside. By some miracle, the keys were in the ignition. The engine roared to life and I slammed it into gear just as rotting hands began to slap against the windows. I floored it, the truck lurching forward and plowing through the crowd of creatures. They went flying, their bodies making sickening thumps as they hit the ground. As I fishtailed onto the highway, I caught one last glimpse of the gas station in my rearview mirror. The creatures were already regrouping, their eyeless faces turned towards the retreating sound of the truck. I drove through the rest of the night in a daze, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. When the sun finally rose, painting the desert in shades of pink and gold, I began to wonder if it had all been some sort of terrible hallucination. But the dried blood on my clothes and the stolen truck I was driving told a different story. Whatever I'd encountered at that gas station was all too real. As I approached the outskirts of the next town, I steeled myself for what came next. I had a story to tell, a warning to give, and something told me that what I'd experienced was just the beginning of something much, much bigger. The open 24 hours sign loomed in my rearview mirror, a beacon for other unsuspecting travelers. But for me, it would forever be a reminder of the night I stumbled into a waking nightmare and somehow made it out alive. The wrench hit the concrete with a clang that echoed through the empty garage. I reached for it, my fingers brushing cold metal, when a voice behind me froze me in place. "Need a hand with that?" I turned, heart racing, to face a man who couldn't possibly be there. A man I'd buried 3 years ago. It had started as a normal night shift at Lou's 24-hour auto repair. Well, as normal as things get when you're the only living soul for miles, surrounded by nothing but darkened fields and a stretch of highway that seems to go on forever. I'd been working at Lou's for about 6 months, ever since I'd moved back to my hometown after everything fell apart. The night shift suited me. Fewer people to deal with, fewer questions to answer. Most nights it was just me, a radio that only picked up static, and the occasional trucker with a blown tire or overheating engine. This particular night was dead quiet. I'd spent most of my shift tinkering with my own project, a '67 Chevy Impala that had seen better days. It was my dad's old car, the one he'd taught me everything I know about engines in. Restoring it was my way of keeping his memory alive, I guess. I was elbow deep in the Impala's engine when I heard it, a car pulling into the lot. The crunch of gravel under tires was unmistakable in the stillness of the night. Wiping my hands on a rag, I stepped out of the garage to greet the customer. The sight that met me made my blood run cold. There, gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights of the forecourt, was a cherry-red 1970 Dodge Challenger. My breath caught in my throat as I took in the familiar curves of the body, the glossy paint job that looked fresh off the assembly line. It was Jamie's car, my best friend who'd wrapped that very same Challenger around a tree 3 years ago. I blinked hard, sure I must be seeing things, but when I opened my eyes, the car was still there, its engine ticking as it cooled. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "Anyone there?" Silence answered me. The driver's door hung open, but there was no sign of whoever had been behind the wheel. Against my better judgment, I approached the car. The interior was immaculate, no sign of the devastating crash that had claimed Jamie's life. I ran my hand along the hood, half expecting it to disappear like a mirage, but the metal was solid and cool beneath my fingers. That's when I noticed the smell. At first I thought it was just gasoline, but there was something else underneath, something earthy and organic. It reminded me of freshly turned soil, I recoiled from the car, my heart pounding. It smelled like a grave. Stumbling backward, I retreated to the safety of the garage. I needed to call someone, the police maybe, or a tow truck to get that thing off my lot. But as I reached for the phone, a sound stopped me dead in my tracks. Footsteps, coming from inside the garage. I whirled around, grabbing the nearest heavy object, a wrench as a makeshift weapon. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. The footsteps grew closer, echoing off the concrete walls. And then from the shadows, a figure emerged. The wrench slipped from my nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor. "Jamie?" I whispered, unable to believe my eyes. He looked exactly as I remembered him, tall and lanky, with a mop of unruly dark hair and that ever-present half-smile. But there was something off about him. His skin was too pale, almost translucent in the harsh lighting of the garage. And his eyes, they seemed to look through me rather than at me. "Hey, buddy," Jamie said, his voice sending chills down my spine. It was him, but not him. Like listening to a recording of someone you used to know. "Looks like I'm having some car trouble. Think you can take a look?" I stumbled backward, my back hitting the workbench. Tools clattered to the floor around me. "You're not real," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You can't be real. You're dead." Jamie's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too white. "Am I? Funny, I don't feel dead." He took a step towards me, and I caught that earthy smell again. Stronger now, mixed with something metallic, like blood and soil. "Stay back," I warned, fumbling behind me for something, anything to defend myself with. Jamie stopped, cocking his head to one side in a gesture so achingly familiar it made my chest hurt. "Come on, man, it's me, your best friend. Don't you want to catch up? It's been a while, after all." My hand closed around something solid, a screwdriver. I brandished it in front of me like a sword. "You're not Jamie," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "I don't know what you are, but you're not him." The thing wearing Jamie's face sighed, a sound like wind whistling through dead leaves. "I'd hoped we could do this the easy way, but I guess we're doing it the hard way." Before I could react, he was on me. His hands, cold as ice, wrapped around my wrists with inhuman strength. The screwdriver clattered to the floor as he pinned me against the workbench. Up close, I could see the details my mind had refused to process before. The gray tinge to his skin, the faint smell of decay that clung to him, the total absence of breath or warmth. "What do you want?" I gasped, struggling against his grip. Jamie, or the thing pretending to be him, leaned in close. When he spoke, I could see the blackness behind his teeth, like his mouth was filled with oil. "I want what was taken from me. I want my life back." A hysterical laugh bubbled up in my throat. "Your life? You're dead, Jamie. You died 3 years ago. I was at your funeral. I saw them lower your casket into the ground." His grip tightened, and I felt something in my wrist creak dangerously. "Details," he hissed. "Technicalities. I'm here now, aren't I? And you're going to help me stay." "How?" I asked, though a part of me already knew the answer and was terrified by it. Jamie's grin was a rictus, a death mask parody of the smile I once knew so well. "It's simple, really. A life for a life. Your life for mine." I renewed my struggles, panic lending me strength I didn't know I had, but it was like trying to fight a statue. Jamie didn't budge an inch. "Why me?" I managed to choke out. "Why here? Why now?" For a moment, something like sadness flickered across Jamie's face. "Because you were my best friend. Because you're the one who lived when I didn't. And because you're the one who was driving that night." The words hit me like a physical blow. Memories I'd tried so hard to suppress came flooding back. The screech of tires, the crunch of metal, the sickening lurch as the world spun out of control. I'd walked away with barely a scratch. Jamie hadn't been so lucky. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. "God, Jamie, I'm so sorry. Not a day goes by that I don't wish it had been me instead of you." Jamie's grip loosened, just a fraction. "Then prove it," he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "Make it right. Take my place and let me have the life I was cheated out of." For a moment, just a moment, I considered it. The guilt I'd been carrying for 3 years weighed on me, threatening to pull me under. Wouldn't it be easier to just let go? But then I thought of my dad's Impala sitting half restored in the garage. I thought of the life I was slowly rebuilding, the future I was working towards. And I knew I couldn't give that up, not even for Jamie. "No," I said, meeting those dead eyes squarely. "I'm sorry, but no, you're gone, Jamie. And whatever you are now, you don't belong here anymore." A sound like a wounded animal escaped Jamie's throat. His face contorted, the facade of humanity slipping away to reveal something ancient and terrible beneath. "Then you leave me no choice," he snarled. What happened next was a blur of motion and terror. I remember breaking free, remember running through the garage with the thing that used to be my best friend hot on my heels. I remember the roar of an engine, the Impala somehow starting on its own, and the screech of tires as it burst through the garage door. The last thing I saw before the Impala hit was Jamie's face, not the monstrous visage of moments before, but the friend I remembered. He looked at peace. When I came to, it was dawn. I was lying on the cold concrete of the garage floor, surrounded by the wreckage of my father's car. Of Jamie's Challenger, there was no sign. The police came, of course. They asked a lot of questions I couldn't answer. In the end, they chalked it up to exhaustion, maybe even hallucinations brought on by fumes in the poorly ventilated garage. I know the truth, though. I know what I saw that night, what I faced. And I know that sometimes the past doesn't stay buried, no matter how deep you try to put it. These days, I still work the night shift at Lou's. But now, when I hear a car pulling in late at night, I always hesitate before stepping out to greet it. Because you never know who or what might be behind the wheel. The key felt unnaturally heavy in my hand, its brass surface gleaming dully in the flickering light of the corridor. Room 666. I'd laughed when the clerk handed it to me, making some quip about the devil's number. But as I stood before the door, an inexplicable dread settled in the pit of my stomach. Little did I know crossing that threshold would plunge me into a nightmare from which I might never wake. It had been a long day on the road. 18 hours of driving through monotonous landscapes, fueled by gas station coffee and the desperate need to put as much distance between myself and my old life as possible. When I spotted the neon vacancy sign of the Paradise Pines Motel glowing like a beacon in the gathering dusk, it felt like salvation. The motel itself was nothing special, just another rundown establishment catering to weary travelers and those with secrets to hide. Paint peeled from the walls, and the carpet in the lobby had seen better days sometime in the previous century. But it was cheap, and it was there, and at that point, I would have slept in my car if it meant I could close my eyes for a few hours. The night clerk barely looked up from his magazine as I approached the desk. He was an older man, his skin weathered and leathery, like he'd spent too many years under a harsh sun. "Room for one," I said, fishing my wallet out of my back pocket. He grunted, tapping a few keys on an ancient computer. "Only got one left. Room 666. I chuckled, more out of exhaustion than actual amusement. "Seriously? You guys actually have a room 666? The clerk shrugged, still not meeting my eyes. "Previous owner thought it was funny. You want it or not?" I hesitated for a moment. Something about his tone, the way he seemed almost eager to be rid of the key, set off a warning bell in the back of my mind. But then I thought of the long, dark road ahead, and my aching muscles protested at the mere idea of getting back behind the wheel. "I'll take it," I said, sliding my credit card across the counter. Now standing before the door with its tarnished numbers, I found myself wishing I'd listened to that little voice of caution. The entire 6th floor seemed off somehow. The air was thick and oppressive, carrying a faint scent I couldn't quite place. Ozone, maybe, or something metallic. I shook my head, trying to clear away the cobwebs of fatigue. "Get it together," I muttered to myself. "It's just a room number." The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed far too loud in the quiet hallway. I pushed the door open, fumbling for the light switch. Nothing happened. Frowning, I flicked the switch up and down a few times. Still nothing. Great. Just what I needed. A room with faulty wiring. I was about to turn around and demand a different room when something caught my eye. There, in the darkness of the room, was a faint glow. It seemed to be coming from the bathroom, a sliver of sickly green light spilling out from under the closed door. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and uncertain in the oppressive silence. "Is someone in here?" No response. Just that eerie, pulsing light. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around, to get out of there and never look back. But curiosity, or maybe just plain stupidity, got the better of me. I took a step into the room, then another. The door swung shut behind me with a soft click that might as well have been a gunshot. I whirled around, heart pounding, but the handle refused to budge. Locked. I was locked in. Panic rose in my throat, threatening to choke me. I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but my cries seemed to be swallowed up by the unnatural darkness of the room. That's when I heard it. A soft, wet sound coming from the direction of the bathroom, like something viscous dripping onto tile. I turned slowly, my eyes now adjusted enough to make out the vague shapes of furniture in the gloom. The bathroom door stood out starkly, that sickly green light pulsing behind it like a diseased heartbeat. As I watched, paralyzed with fear, the light began to intensify. It seeped out from under the door, crawling across the carpet like luminous tendrils. And with it came that sound again. Drip, 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 growing louder with each passing second. A whimper escaped my lips as I pressed myself against the locked door, desperate to put as much distance between myself and whatever was in that bathroom as possible. But the light continued to advance, and with it came a smell that made my stomach heave, the stench of rot and decay, of things long dead yet somehow still moving. The bathroom door began to rattle in its frame as if something on the other side was trying to get out. The rattling grew more intense, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that no human throat could produce. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying to whatever higher power might be listening that this was all just some vivid hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But when I opened them again, the nightmare was still there, and it was getting worse. The light had reached my feet now, and where it touched, I felt a burning sensation even through my shoes. I yelped, scrambling to climb up the door like a cornered animal. With a sound like tearing flesh, the bathroom door burst open. What spilled out, I still struggled to describe it even now. It was darkness given form, a writhing mass of tentacles and eyes and gaping maws filled with needle-sharp teeth. The stench that accompanied it was overpowering, the smell of 1,000 open graves. As it surged towards me, I did the only thing I could think of. I started reciting every prayer, every protective incantation I'd ever heard. Words tumbled from my lips in a desperate stream, a mix of half-remembered Sunday school lessons and snippets of exorcism scenes from movies. To my amazement, it seemed to work. The thing recoiled, letting out a shriek that made my ears ring. The light flickered, dimming for just a moment. In that instant of reprieve, my hand found the door handle again. This time it turned. I fell backward into the hallway, scrambling to my feet and running as fast as my legs would carry me. I didn't stop until I reached the lobby, bursting through the doors like the hounds of hell were on my heels. The night clerk looked up, alarm flashing across his face for just a moment before settling back into that mask of indifference. "Problem with the room?" he asked, as casually as if he were inquiring about the weather. I stared at him, chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. "Problem? Problem? There's something in there, some kind of monster or demon or I don't know what." He sighed, reaching under the counter. For a wild moment, I thought he was going for a weapon, but what he pulled out was a thick, leather-bound book. "Looks like you've had an encounter with our special guest," he said, flipping through the pages. "Don't worry, you're not the first, won't be the last either." I gaped at him, unable to process what I was hearing. What are you talking about? You knew about this?" He nodded, finding the page he was looking for. "Oh yes, it's been here longer than the motel has. We just coexist with it. Most of the time, it's content to stay in its room, but every now and then it gets hungry." A hysterical laugh bubbled up in my throat. "Hungry? That thing tried to eat me?" The clerk shrugged. "Probably would have if you hadn't started praying. It doesn't like that much. Holy words, symbols, that sort of thing, drives it back for a while." My mind reeled, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. "So what, you just let it stay there, feeding on unsuspecting guests?" "Not unsuspecting," he corrected, turning the book around so I could see. "See this waiver here? All guests in room 666 have to sign it. Releases us from liability for any supernatural occurrences." I stared at the page, covered in line after line of tiny text. At the bottom, clear as day, was my own signature. I don't remember signing this," I stammered. The clerk smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You did. They always do. Part of its power, I suppose, makes you forget right up until the moment you're face to face with it." I felt sick. How many people have died in that room?" He shrugged again. "Died? None that I know of. Most make it out like you did. Some decide to stay." A chill ran down my spine at his words. "Stay? Why would anyone choose to stay?" The clerk's eyes took on a faraway look. "It offers things, you see. Knowledge, power, the answers to questions you never even knew to ask. For some, that's worth any price." I shook my head, backing away from the desk. "You're insane. All of this is insane. I'm leaving, and I'm calling the police." He didn't try to stop me as I headed for the door. But just before I stepped out into the night, he called out, "It won't do any good, you know. The police, I mean. They've been here before, never find anything." I paused, my hand on the door handle. "Then why tell me all this? Why not just let me think I was crazy?" The clerk was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy with something that might have been regret. "Because you made it out, and because, well, let's just say I was in your shoes once, a long time ago." I turned to look at him, really look at him for the first time. In the harsh fluorescent light of the lobby, I could see that what I had taken for age was something else entirely. His skin wasn't weathered. It was scarred, covered in marks that looked disturbingly like sucker marks from some enormous tentacle. "What happened to you?" I whispered. He smiled, and this time it was genuine and infinitely sad. "I chose to stay, and now I can never leave." I fled into the night, the sound of his laughter following me all the way to my car. As I peeled out of the parking lot, I caught one last glimpse of the Paradise Pines Motel in my rearview mirror. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw something moving behind the window of room 666, something vast and dark and hungry. I drove through the night, putting as many miles between myself and that cursed place as I could. But no matter how far I go, I can't shake the feeling that a part of me is still there, locked in that room with whatever nightmare creature calls it home. And sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, I find myself wondering, what would I have seen if I had chosen to stay? The headlights appeared in my rearview mirror, growing larger with alarming speed. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, ready to swerve onto the shoulder. But as the car drew closer, my blood ran cold. The headlights weren't in front, they were in back. And they were coming straight for me, in reverse. It was supposed to be a routine drive home from my late shift at the diner. The same stretch of lonely highway I'd traveled 100 times before, with nothing but miles of cornfields on either side and a sky full of stars overhead. But that night, everything changed. I'd been on the road for about an hour when I first noticed something odd. The traffic, sparse as it was at 2 a.m., seemed off somehow. Cars would appear in my rearview mirror, then vanish when I looked for them in my side views. At first, I chalked it up to fatigue. 18-hour shifts will do that to you, make you see things that aren't there. But then I saw it. A sleek black sedan, its chrome accents gleaming under the moonlight. It was driving backwards, matching my speed perfectly, its taillights glowing an eerie red in the darkness ahead of me. I blinked hard, sure I must be hallucinating. But when I opened my eyes, the car was still there, still driving in reverse as smoothly as if it were going forward. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone. But the screen remained stubbornly dark, dead battery, of course. I eased my foot off the gas, letting my speed drop. The backwards car slowed too, maintaining the same distance between us. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized it was mimicking my every move. Okay, I muttered to myself, trying to keep the panic at bay. Okay, think. There's got to be a logical explanation for this. But no matter how hard I racked my brain, I couldn't come up with anything that made sense. Cars don't drive backwards at 70 miles per hour, they just don't. I considered pulling over, but something told me that would be a mistake. Whatever was going on, I had a feeling I'd be safer if I kept moving. So I drove on, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, constantly flicking my eyes between the road ahead and the impossible sight in my rearview mirror. The backwards car never wavered, never fell behind or pulled ahead. It was like we were tethered together by some unseen force. As the minutes ticked by, I became aware of other changes. The cornfields on either side of the highway seemed to be moving in the wrong direction, as if I were driving backwards and they were rushing past me. Road signs flashed by, but when I tried to read them, the letters were all jumbled like some alien language. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. This wasn't just some optical illusion or trick of the light. Something was very, very wrong. That's when I saw the gas station up ahead, its fluorescent lights a beacon of normalcy in this surreal nightmare. Without hesitation, I signaled and took the exit, tires squealing as I pulled into the parking lot. The backwards car followed, gliding into the lot in reverse as smoothly as if it were being pulled by an invisible string. It came to a stop at the pump opposite mine, its headlights still facing me. For a long moment, I just sat there, engine idling, too terrified to move. But I knew I couldn't stay in the car forever. Taking a deep breath, I steeled myself and opened the door. The night air hit me like a slap to the face, heavy with the scent of gasoline and something else. Something old and musty, like books left too long in a damp basement. I shivered, wrapping my arms around myself as I approached the backwards car. As I drew closer, I could see that the windows were tinted so dark they were nearly opaque. But there was movement inside, a shifting of shadows that made my skin crawl. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and frightened even to my own ears. "Is anyone there?" The driver's side door opened with a soft click. But instead of someone stepping out, I watched in horrified fascination as a foot emerged first, followed by a leg, then a torso. It was as if the driver was being pulled out of the car by some invisible force. When the figure finally stood before me, I had to clamp a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. It was a man, or at least it had the shape of a man. But everything about him was wrong. His clothes were on backwards, his face where the back of his head should be. And that face, it was mine. The thing that wore my face smiled, the expression eerie and unnatural from this angle. When it spoke, its voice was mine, but reversed, the words coming out as a garbled mess that somehow I could still understand. "Imaclu Cab," it said. "Welcome back." I stumbled backwards, my back hitting the cool metal of my own car. What are you?" I managed to choke out. The thing cocked its head to the side, an unsettlingly bird-like motion. "Oi," it replied. "You." My mind reeled, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, what I was hearing. "I don't understand," I said, hating how weak and frightened I sounded. The backwards me took a step forward, its movements fluid but wrong, like watching a video played in reverse. Imo nimok erwoi, it said. You're coming home. Home? I repeated, bewildered. I was going home, before all this started. It shook its head, an oddly sympathetic expression crossing its backwards face. Imo laer ruoi, ere, your real home. Here. As it spoke, I became aware of changes happening around us. The gas station was shifting, its edges blurring and reforming. The night sky above began to swirl, stars streaking across the darkness like paint on a cosmic canvas. What's happening? I asked, panic rising in my throat. Nireb memer eroi, the thing said. You're remembering. And suddenly I was. Memories flooded my mind, but they were wrong, backwards. I saw myself living a life in reverse, growing younger instead of older, experiences unraveling instead of forming, and through it all a sense of longing, of homesickness for a place I'd never known I'd left. No, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. No, this isn't real. It can't be. The backwards me reached out, its hand inches from my face. L'air il no et sisit, it said softly. This is the only real. I wanted to run, to flee back to my car and drive until this nightmare was nothing but a distant memory. But I couldn't move. It was as if my body had forgotten how to work in this backwards world. The thing's hand touched my cheek, its skin cold and somehow insubstantial. The moment it made contact, the world around us shattered like a broken mirror. I felt myself falling, tumbling through fragments of reality. I saw flashes of other lives, other versions of myself driving down endless highways, all of them being called back to this impossible place. When the falling sensation finally stopped, I found myself standing on a road that stretched out infinitely in both directions. The backwards car was there, its door open in invitation. And behind the wheel, my other self waited patiently. Ider uoi er, it asked. Are you ready? I looked back the way I had come at the fading remnants of the life I had thought was real. Then I turned to face the backwards road, the impossible journey ahead. I'm ready, I heard myself say, the words coming out in reverse. As I slid into the passenger seat, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face was on backwards now, my clothes reversed. I had become like the other me, a denizen of this backwards world. The car pulled away from the non-existent shoulder, driving in reverse down the infinite highway. As we picked up speed, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I was going home, even if home was a place I had never known I'd left. Now, as I tell you this story, I do so from the other side of the mirror. I drive the backwards highways, guiding lost souls back to where they truly belong. And sometimes on quiet nights when the stars align just right, I visit the world of forwards, seeking out those who are ready to remember. So the next time you're driving down a lonely stretch of road in the dead of night and you see a car approaching in your rearview mirror, driving backwards with impossible grace, don't be afraid. It might just be me, coming to take you home. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting an eerie glow across the empty parking lot. I'd been driving for hours, my eyes heavy with fatigue, when I saw the gas station sign looming in the distance. As I pulled up to the pump, I had no idea that this mundane pit stop would change my life forever. The night was unusually still. No crickets chirping, no distant rumble of traffic, just an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow every sound. I stepped out of my car, the cold air biting at my skin, and that's when I noticed him. The attendant, standing motionless behind the counter, staring right at me through the grimy window. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. It was just a gas station, after all, nothing to worry about. I told myself this as I wrestled with the pump, my fingers numb from the cold. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The bell above the door chimed as I stepped inside, the sound jarring in the quiet night. The attendant didn't move, didn't even blink. He was older, probably in his 60s, with deep-set eyes and a face etched with lines that spoke of a hard life. Evening, I managed, my voice sounding too loud in the empty store. Just the gas on pump 3. He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving my face. You're the first customer I've had all night, he said, his voice a low rasp that sent a shiver down my spine. Gets lonely out here, especially after dark. I fumbled for my wallet, suddenly eager to pay and get back on the road. But something in his eyes held me there, a haunted look that made my curiosity override my instinct to flee. Must be boring, I said, trying to keep my tone casual. Nothing ever happens out here, right? The attendant's lips curled into a humorless smile. Oh, things happen all right, things you wouldn't believe. I should have left then, should have paid for my gas and gotten the hell out of there, but I didn't. Instead, I heard myself asking, like what? He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the counter. You ever hear of the midnight trucker? I shook my head, my mouth suddenly dry. It was a night just like this, he began, his eyes taking on a faraway look. Cold, quiet, I was working the graveyard shift, same as always. Around 2 a.m., this big rig pulls in. Nothing unusual about that. We get a lot of truckers passing through. He paused, reaching for a pack of cigarettes. His hands shook slightly as he lit one, the smoke curling up towards the yellowed ceiling. The driver, though, there was something off about him. He was tall, real tall, and thin as a rail. Wore this old-fashioned cap pulled low over his eyes. I remember thinking his clothes looked out of date, like something from the 50s or 60s. I found myself leaning in, drawn into his story despite my better judgment. He came in to pay for his diesel, didn't say a word. Just slid a handful of coins across the counter, old coins, the kind you don't see much anymore. When I looked up to thank him, I swear his eyes, they were just empty sockets, black as night. A chill ran through me, and I glanced nervously at the door. The parking lot beyond was still empty, my car the only vehicle in sight. The attendant took a long drag on his cigarette, the ember glowing bright in the dim store. I blinked, and his eyes were normal again. Figured I must have imagined it. He left without a word, climbed back into his rig, and drove off. He fell silent for a moment, lost in the memory. I found myself holding my breath, waiting for him to continue. The next morning, I hear on the news about a horrible pileup on the highway about 50 miles from here. Multiple fatalities. They say it was caused by a phantom truck that appeared out of nowhere, driving on the wrong side of the road. Witnesses described a tall, thin driver in an old-fashioned cap. My heart was pounding now, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. But that's impossible, I stammered. The attendant nodded slowly. That's what I thought too, until it happened again and again, always the same. The truck pulls in late at night, the driver pays with old coins, and the next day there's news of a terrible accident. He crushed out his cigarette, his eyes locking onto mine. I've seen that truck pull in here at least a dozen times over the years, and every single time people die. I swallowed hard, trying to process what I was hearing. It had to be a joke, right? Some sick game this lonely old man played with gullible travelers, but the look in his eyes, there was no hint of deception there. Only a bone-deep weariness and fear. Why? I had to clear my throat to continue. Why are you telling me this? His expression softened slightly, a flicker of sympathy crossing his weathered features. Because, son, I saw that truck pull in here about an hour ago, and I've got a feeling you're headed the same way it was going. My blood ran cold. I thought about the long, dark stretch of highway ahead of me, winding through the mountains. The idea of encountering this phantom truck out there in the darkness. You're joking, I said weakly, but I knew he wasn't. He shook his head slowly. I wish I was. Look, why don't you stick around for a while, have a cup of coffee, wait for the sun to come up. It's safer that way. Part of me wanted to take him up on the offer, to wait out the night in this dingy gas station, surrounded by shelves of stale snacks and outdated magazines. But a larger part of me rebelled against the idea. This was crazy. I couldn't let some old man's ghost story derail my trip. Thanks, but I really need to get going, I said, pulling out my credit card. I've got a long drive ahead of me. The attendant's face fell, a look of resignation settling over him. He rang up my purchase in silence, his movements slow and deliberate. As he handed me the receipt, his fingers brushed against mine. They were ice cold. Be careful out there, he said softly. And if you see a set of headlights in your rear view that seem to be getting too close, whatever you do, don't slow down. Don't pull over. Just keep driving as fast as you can until you see the sun come up. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As I turned to leave, he called out one last time. And son, if you make it through the night, come back and let me know, will you? It'd be nice to know someone escaped him. The bell chimed again as I stepped out into the night. The air seemed colder now, heavy with an unseen menace. I climbed into my car with shaking hands, the attendant's story echoing in my mind. As I pulled out of the gas station, I caught one last glimpse of him in my rearview mirror. He stood motionless behind the counter, watching me drive away. I couldn't shake the feeling that I might be the last person to ever see him alive. The highway stretched out before me, a ribbon of black disappearing into the darkness. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Every set of approaching headlights sent my heart racing. I found myself gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, my eyes constantly darting to the rearview mirror. For miles, nothing happened. The road remained empty, the night quiet except for the hum of my engine and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. I began to relax, telling myself that I'd let an old man's tale get the better of me. There was no phantom truck, no ghostly driver claiming lives on this lonely stretch of highway. It was just a story, nothing more. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a pinprick of light in the distance behind me, but it grew quickly, a set of headlights bearing down on me with impossible speed. My heart leapt into my throat as I remembered the attendant's warning. Don't slow down, don't pull over, just keep driving as fast as you can until you see the sun come up. I pressed down on the accelerator, my car surging forward, but the headlights kept coming, growing larger in my mirror with each passing second. I could make out the outline of a massive truck now, its chrome grille gleaming in the moonlight. My hands were slick with sweat as I navigated the twisting mountain road, taking each turn faster than was safe. The truck stayed right on my tail, so close I could no longer see its headlights in my rearview mirror. Just a looming black shape filling my entire back window. I don't know how long I drove like that, my eyes darting between the road ahead and the mirror, expecting at any moment to feel the impact of the truck slamming into me. My fuel gauge dipped lower and lower, and I realized with growing horror that I couldn't keep this up much longer. Just as I was about to give up hope, to pull over and face whatever fate awaited me, I saw it. A faint lightening of the sky to the east. Dawn was coming. With renewed energy, I pressed down even harder on the accelerator. The first rays of sunlight peeked over the horizon, painting the world in soft gold. And just like that, the truck was gone. I looked in my rearview mirror and saw only empty roads stretching out behind me. I drove until I found another gas station, this one busy with morning commuters. As I filled up my nearly empty tank, my hands still shaking, I thought about the attendant back at the lonely pump. Had it all been real? Part of me wanted to dismiss it as a hallucination brought on by fatigue and an overactive imagination. But I knew better. The terror of that night drive was too visceral, too real to be a mere figment of my imagination. And I knew that someday, when I was ready, I would make the drive back to that isolated gas station. Not just to tell the attendant that I had survived, but to hear the rest of his story. Because somehow I knew that what he had told me was only the beginning. The real mystery, the true horror, was still out there, waiting on that dark highway for its next victim. As I pulled back onto the road, the morning sun warm on my face, I made a silent promise. I would uncover the truth about the midnight trucker, no matter where that journey might lead me. But for now, I was just grateful to see another dawn. The lonely pump and its haunted attendant were behind me, but their story would stay with me forever. And in the years to come, whenever I found myself driving late at night, I would always keep one eye on my rearview mirror, watching for a pair of headlights that seemed to be getting just a little too close. The first words I heard through the static made my blood run cold. This message is for Sarah Lawson. That's my name, my full name, the one I never use. But let me back up. You need to understand how I ended up on this godforsaken stretch of highway in the first place. It was supposed to be a simple road trip, a chance to clear my head after the mess of a breakup I'd just been through. Just me, my beat-up Honda Civic, and 500 miles of open road between Seattle and San Francisco. I had it all planned out, playlists curated, snacks packed, and a couple of audiobooks loaded up on my phone for when the radio inevitably cut out in the more remote areas. The first few hours were uneventful. I sang along to my favorite songs, windows down, the cool Pacific Northwest air whipping through my hair. As the sun began to set, I hit the coastal highway. That's when things started to get weird. It began with little blips of static cutting into my music. Nothing major at first, just a second or two of interference here and there. I fiddled with the tuning, but it didn't help. As the sky darkened and the road narrowed, winding its way along cliff sides and through dense forests, the static got worse. I switched to my phone's audio, but even that was affected. Every few minutes, my carefully crafted playlist would be interrupted by bursts of white noise. It was annoying, sure, but I tried not to let it bother me. I focused on the road ahead, illuminated only by my headlights and the occasional glimpse of moonlight through the trees. And then, right as I was crossing into California, it happened. The music cut out completely, replaced by a low, persistent hum. I reached for the dial, ready to turn the whole system off, when a voice crackled through the speakers. "This message is for Sarah Lawson." I nearly drove off the road. My heart pounding, I pulled over onto the narrow shoulder, gravel crunching under my tires. The voice continued, fading in and out through waves of static. Sarah Elizabeth Lawson, born September 17, 1992, in Tacoma, Washington. My hands were shaking now. How did they know that? I never used my middle name. Hell, most of my friends didn't even know I had one. "We've been waiting for you, Sarah. We've been watching." I fumbled for my phone, ready to call someone. The police? My parents? But there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. I was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by towering redwoods in a darkness so complete it felt almost alive. The voice on the radio changed, becoming deeper, more distorted. "Do you remember what happened 10 years ago, Sarah? Do you remember what you did?" My breath caught in my throat. 10 years ago. The summer after high school graduation, the night everything changed. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum of the engine and the persistent static. "That was an accident. I never meant for—" "But it happened, didn't it?" the voice interrupted. "And now it's time to face the consequences." I shook my head, trying to clear it. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of sick prank. Maybe my ex had somehow hacked my car's system, was playing some elaborate joke to get back at me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. With trembling fingers, I tried to turn off the radio. Nothing happened. I pressed every button, turned every dial. The voice kept speaking, growing louder, more insistent. "Drive to the next exit, Sarah. Take the unmarked road. We're waiting for you." "No," I said, louder this time. "This isn't happening. You're not real." Laughter crackled through the speakers, a sound so chilling it made my skin crawl. "Oh, we're very real, Sarah, and we're very close. Look in your rearview mirror." Against my better judgment, I did. At first, I saw nothing but darkness. Then slowly a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. They were moving fast, much faster than should have been possible on this twisting, treacherous road. Panic seized me. I threw the car into drive and peeled out, tires spinning on the loose gravel before finding purchase. The engine roared as I accelerated, taking the curves too fast, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The voice on the radio laughed again. "You can't outrun us, Sarah. You can't outrun your past." I tried to drown it out, singing to myself, screaming even, but the voice persisted. It began to recite details of that night 10 years ago, things no one else could possibly know. The color of the dress I was wearing, the song that was playing when it happened, the exact words I'd said in the moments after. Tears streamed down my face as I drove, the memories I'd worked so hard to bury clawing their way to the surface. The headlights behind me grew closer, no matter how fast I went. "Exit now, Sarah," the voice commanded. And there it was, a small, unmarked road branching off from the highway. Every instinct screamed at me to keep going, to ignore it, but my hands seemed to move of their own accord. I found myself turning onto the narrow, unpaved track. The trees pressed in close here, their branches scraping against the roof of my car. The headlights behind me disappeared, but I could still hear the sound of an engine, growing louder. "You're almost there," the voice said, softer now, almost gentle. "It's time to finish what you started, Sarah." The road ended abruptly in a small clearing. In the center stood a familiar figure, illuminated by the glow of a single street lamp that had no business being out here in the wilderness. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding to a stop mere feet from the person I'd spent 10 years trying to forget. Megan. But it couldn't be her. Megan was dead. I'd seen her fall. I'd heard the crack as her head hit the rocks below. I'd watched as the waves pulled her body out to sea. And yet, here she stood, pale and ghostly in the harsh light, but unmistakably Megan. She looked exactly as she had that night, right down to the blue dress with the tear in the hem. I sat frozen in my seat, unable to move, Unable to breathe, Megan, or whatever this thing was that looked like her, smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "Hello, Sarah," she said, her voice perfectly matching the one that had been coming through my radio. "It's been a long time." With shaking hands, I unlocked the car door and stepped out. My legs felt weak, barely able to support me. "You're not real," I said, my voice hoarse. "You can't be." Megan's smile widened, revealing too many teeth. "I'm as real as the guilt you've been carrying all these years. As real as the lies you've told yourself to sleep at night." I shook my head, backing away. "It was an accident. We were just kids, fooling around on the cliffs. I never meant to push you. I tried to grab you, but you let go," Megan finished. "You watched me fall, and then you ran. You never told anyone what really happened." The accusation hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to deny it, to explain, but the words wouldn't come, because she was right. I had run. I'd let everyone believe Megan had been alone that night, that she'd slipped and fallen on her own. I'd lived with that lie for a decade. "Why now?" I finally managed to ask. "Why come back after all this time?" Megan took a step closer, and I noticed with growing horror that her feet didn't quite touch the ground. "Because you were finally ready to listen, ready to remember." As she spoke, the clearing around us began to change. The trees melted away, replaced by craggy cliffs and the sound of crashing waves. I could smell the salt in the air, feel the ocean spray on my face. We were back there on that terrible night. "No," I whispered, squeezing my eyes shut. "I can't do this again. I can't." "You have to," Megan said, her voice echoing strangely. "It's the only way to set us both free." When I opened my eyes, we were standing on the edge of the cliff. Below us, the waves crashed against the rocks, hungry and relentless, just like that night. Megan held out her hand. "You have a choice to make, Sarah. You can keep running, keep lying to yourself and everyone else, or you can face what happened. You can make it right." I stared at her outstretched hand, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to turn and run, to get back in my car and drive until this all faded into just another bad dream. But I knew it would never be over if I did that. This moment, this choice, would haunt me forever. With a deep breath, I reached out and took Megan's hand. It was ice cold. "I'm sorry," I said, the words I'd been holding back for 10 years finally spilling out. "I'm so sorry, Megan, for everything." As soon as the words left my mouth, the world around us began to dissolve. The cliffs, the ocean, even Megan herself started to fade away like mist in the morning sun. The last thing I saw was her smile, a real smile this time, full of forgiveness and release. I blinked and I was back in my car, parked on the side of the coastal highway. The radio was playing soft static, but as I watched, it cleared, returning to the song that had been playing before all this started. For a long moment, I just sat there, my hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to process what had just happened. Had it been real? A hallucination brought on by fatigue and guilt? Or something in between? I didn't have answers. But as I pulled back onto the highway, continuing my journey south, I felt different. Lighter somehow, as if a weight I'd been carrying for years had finally been lifted. The rest of the drive passed without incident. No more static, no more mysterious voices, just me, the open road, and the first light of dawn breaking on the horizon. As I crossed the Golden Gate Bridge, the sun fully risen now, I made a decision. When I got to San Francisco, I was going to call Megan's parents. I was going to tell them the truth, all of it. It was long overdue. The radio announcer's voice cut through my thoughts, jarringly normal after everything that had happened. And that was "Static Speaks My Name" by the Postal Service. Up next. I quickly switched off the radio, a chill running down my spine. It might have been a coincidence, but I'd had enough of mysterious broadcasts for one lifetime. Whatever had happened out there in the dark, whatever force had reached out to me, I had a feeling it was satisfied now. The story had been told, the truth acknowledged. The static, it seemed, had spoken my name for the last time. As I navigated the busy San Francisco streets, I felt like I was waking up from a long, dark dream. The city bustled around me, full of life and possibility. For the first time in 10 years, I felt ready to join it, free from the past, ready for whatever came next. The moment my car sputtered to a stop, I knew I was screwed. But when I saw the faded sign half hidden in the overgrown brush, Welcome to Pine Creek, Pop. 1,206 inches, my blood ran cold. This wasn't just any small town. This was the site of the notorious Pine Creek massacres. I'd been driving for hours, taking the scenic route from Portland to my new job in San Francisco. It was supposed to be an adventure, a chance to see the Pacific Northwest's back roads before settling into city life. Instead, I found myself stranded in the last place anyone would want to be after dark. The Pine Creek massacres had been all over the news when I was a kid, a series of brutal, unsolved murders that had rocked this tiny logging town over the course of a summer 20 years ago. The killings had stopped as abruptly as they began, but the case was never solved. The town had all but died afterwards, most residents fleeing in terror. And now here I was, smoke curling from under the hood of my ancient Volvo right at the town limits. I pulled out my phone, praying for a signal. Nothing. Of course. The sun was setting fast, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds that might have been beautiful if I wasn't scared out of my mind. I popped the hood, hoping against hope that it was something simple I could fix, but as soon as I saw the tangle of wires and pipes, I knew it was hopeless. I was a writer, not a mechanic. A cool breeze rustled through the pines lining the road, and I shivered. It sounded almost like whispers. I weighed my options. I could stay with the car and hope someone drove by, but on this lonely stretch of road, that could take hours, or days. Or I could walk into town and try to find help. Neither option was great. But as the shadows lengthened and the temperature dropped, I made my decision. I grabbed my backpack, locked the car, for all the good it would do, and started walking towards Pine Creek. The road wound through dense forest, the trees pressing close on either side. Every snapping twig made me jump. I tried to focus on putting one foot in front of the other, tried not to think about the stories I'd read about the massacres, about bodies found in these very woods, mutilated beyond recognition. It was fully dark by the time I saw the first buildings. They loomed out of the gloom, abandoned houses with boarded-up windows and sagging porches. Nature was reclaiming the town. Vines crawled up walls and weeds burst through cracks in the sidewalk. I walked down what must have been the main street, my footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. Most of the storefronts were empty, their signs faded and illegible, but there at the end of the street a faint light glowed. As I got closer, I made out a neon open sign flickering in the window of what looked like an old diner. My heart leapt. Maybe I'd find help after all. The bell above the door jingled as I entered, making me wince at the sudden noise. The diner looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1950s. Cracked vinyl booths, a jukebox in the corner, a long counter with chrome-edged stools, and at that counter, hunched over a cup of coffee, sat an old man. He turned as I came in, his rheumy eyes narrowing as he took me in. "You're not from around here," he said. It wasn't a question. I shook my head, suddenly nervous. My car broke down just outside of town. I was hoping to find a mechanic, or at least a phone I could use. The old man snorted. "Ain't no mechanics left in Pine Creek. Ain't much of anything left." A door behind the counter opened and a woman emerged. She was probably in her 60s with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw me. "Now, Earl," she chided the old man, "don't be rude to our guest." She turned to me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm afraid Earl's right, though. We don't have a mechanic. Nearest one's in Oak Ridge, about 40 miles east." My heart sank. "Is there a hotel at least? Somewhere I could stay the night?" The woman and Earl exchanged a look I couldn't quite interpret. "Well," the woman said slowly, "the hotel's been closed for years, but we do have a spare room upstairs. You're welcome to it if you'd like." Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to take my chances in the woods rather than stay in this ghost town. But I was exhausted, and the thought of stumbling through the dark forest was even less appealing than staying here. "That would be great," I heard myself say. "Thank you." The woman nodded. "I'm Helen. Come on, I'll show you up." As I followed Helen up a narrow staircase, I couldn't shake the feeling of Earl's eyes boring into my back. The room was small and musty with faded floral wallpaper and a sagging twin bed, but it was shelter, and right now, that was all I cared about. "Bathroom's down the hall," Helen said. "I'll bring you up some towels. You must be hungry. I could fix you a sandwich?" My stomach growled at the mention of food. I nodded gratefully. Helen returned a few minutes later with a plate and some towels. The sandwich looked good, but as I bit into it, I noticed Helen lingering in the doorway watching me. "You know," she said casually, "you're the first outsider we've had stay here in, must be 20 years now." I swallowed hard. "Since the incidents?" Helen's face hardened. "We don't talk about that. Those were dark times." "I'm sorry," I said quickly. "I didn't mean to bring up bad memories." Helen waved a hand dismissively. "It's late. You should get some rest. We'll see about your car in the morning." She left, closing the door behind her. I heard her footsteps recede down the hall, then down the stairs. Muffled voices drifted up from below. Helen and Earl talking in low, urgent tones. I finished my sandwich, my appetite gone. The voices continued downstairs, occasionally rising before dropping again. I couldn't make out words, but the tone was tense. Sleep seemed impossible, but eventually exhaustion won out. I drifted off into uneasy dreams, filled with dark woods and shadowy figures. A noise jolted me awake. I blinked in the darkness, disoriented. How long had I been asleep? The room was pitch black, the only sound my own ragged breathing. Then I heard it again. A floorboard creaking in the hallway. I froze, straining my ears. Slow, heavy footsteps approached my door. They stopped right outside. The doorknob began to turn, slowly, so slowly. I held my breath, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it must be audible. The door opened a crack, a sliver of deeper darkness. A shape filled the doorway, bulky and menacing. I could hear raspy breathing. In that moment, all the stories I'd read about the Pine Creek massacres flashed through my mind. The brutality, the sadism, the killer who was never caught. I did the only thing I could think of. I screamed. The shape in the doorway jerked back. Footsteps thundered up the stairs, and suddenly the hall light flicked on. Helen appeared in the doorway, a baseball bat in her hands. Behind her, I saw Earl, clutching a shotgun. "What happened?" Helen demanded, her eyes darting around the room. I pointed a shaking finger at the doorway. "Someone was there, a man, I think. He was coming in." Helen and Earl exchanged another of those unreadable looks. "Ain't nobody here but us," Earl growled. "But I saw—" "It was probably just shadows," Helen cut in smoothly. "These old buildings, they play tricks on you, especially if you've been thinking about, the past." I wanted to argue, to insist that what I'd seen was real, but doubt was already creeping in. Had it just been a dream? A hallucination brought on by stress and an overactive imagination? "I'm sorry," I mumbled. "I guess I'm more on edge than I thought." Helen's face softened. "It's understandable. Why don't you try to get some more sleep? Things will look better in the morning." They left, Helen casting one last look over her shoulder before closing the door. I heard them murmuring in the hall, their voices too low to make out. Sleep was out of the question now. I sat up in bed, my back against the wall, straining to hear any sound in the old building. The rest of the night passed in a haze of paranoia and exhaustion. Every creak of the settling building, every whisper of wind outside set my nerves on edge. When the first light of dawn finally began to seep through the grimy window, I almost cried with relief. I crept downstairs, my backpack clutched to my chest. The diner was empty. On the counter was a note. "Gone to check on your car. Back soon. H." I didn't wait. I scribbled a quick thank you note and left some cash for the room and food. Then I walked out into the cool morning air and started down the road away from Pine Creek. I'd only gone about a mile when I heard a vehicle approaching. An old tow truck rumbled into view, my Volvo on its bed. Helen was behind the wheel. She pulled up alongside me, rolling down the window. "Where are you going? I was just bringing your car back." I hesitated. In the light of day, my fears from the night before seemed silly, paranoid. Helen must have seen the conflict on my face. She sighed. "Look, I know Pine Creek doesn't make a great first impression. We've been through a lot, but we're not monsters. We're just folks trying to live our lives." I studied her face. There was sadness there and weariness, but also a glimmer of hope. "Tell you what," Helen continued. "Why don't you come back to the diner? I'll make you some breakfast, and Earl can take a look at your car. He used to be a mechanic back in the day. If he can't fix it, we'll get you to Oak Ridge. No charge." I thought about the long walk ahead and my grumbling stomach. Against my better judgment, I nodded. As we drove back into Pine Creek, I saw the town with new eyes. Yes, it was run down and haunted by its past. But I could also see signs of life. A freshly painted shutter here, a small garden there. Maybe Pine Creek wasn't dying. Maybe it was healing. I didn't know what had really happened last night. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Or maybe there were still secrets in Pine Creek, wounds that hadn't fully healed. But as we pulled up to the diner where Earl was waiting with a toolbox and a hesitant smile, I made a decision. I would stay, at least for a little while. I would listen to their stories, try to understand. After all, every town has its ghosts. Sometimes the only way to lay them to rest is to shine a light on them. As I followed Helen into the diner, the bell jingling cheerfully, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled into a story, one that was still being written. And maybe, just maybe, I was meant to be a part of it. I should have known something was off when I saw her standing there in the pouring rain, not a drop on her white dress. It was well past midnight, and I was driving down Route 43, that long stretch of nothing between Millbrook and Ashton. The rain was coming down in sheets, my wipers barely keeping up. I was exhausted, having driven for nearly 10 hours straight, chasing a deadline for work. That's when I saw her. She was standing on the side of the road, thumb out, pale arm luminous against the darkness. I nearly drove past. It was late, I was tired, and picking up hitchhikers is how horror movies start, right? But something made me slow down. Maybe it was the rain or the lateness of the hour or just the sheer unlikeliness of anyone else being out here. I pulled over, rolling down the passenger window. "Hey, you need a ride?" She leaned down and I got my first good look at her face. She was young, maybe early 20s, with long dark hair and eyes that seemed too old for her face. "Yes, please," she said, her voice barely audible over the rain. "I'm headed to Ashton." "Hop in," I said, reaching over to unlock the door. "That's where I'm going, too." She slid into the passenger seat and I noticed two things immediately. First, despite standing in the rain, she was completely dry. Second, she wasn't wearing a seatbelt. "You might want to buckle up," I said, pulling back onto the road. "It's pretty slick out there." She smiled, a small, sad thing. "Don't worry about me, I'll be fine." I shrugged and focused on the road. The rain, if anything, was coming down harder now. The lines on the pavement were barely visible, and the thick forest on either side of the road seemed to press in, swallowing up the beam of my headlights. We drove in silence for a few minutes. I was acutely aware of my passenger, sitting unnaturally still, her hands folded in her lap. I snuck glances at her when I could. She was pretty, in an old-fashioned sort of way. Her white dress looked like something from another era, with a high collar and long sleeves. "So," I said, trying to break the awkward silence, "what brings you out to the middle of nowhere on a night like this?" She turned to look at me, and for a moment I could have sworn her eyes reflected the light like a cat's. "I could ask you the same thing," she said softly. I chuckled nervously. "Work, unfortunately. I'm a freelance photographer, and I've got a shoot in Ashton tomorrow morning. Or today, I guess, technically. Couldn't get a hotel room, so I'm driving straight through." She nodded, turning back to the window. "I used to want to be a photographer," she said, her voice wistful. "Never got the chance, though." "Oh? What happened?" She was quiet for so long I thought she hadn't heard me. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I died." I laughed, a short, sharp sound in the quiet car. "Good one. You had me going for a second there." But she didn't laugh. She just kept staring out the window, her reflection ghostly in the glass. "It was a night just like this," she said, "raining so hard you could barely see. I was coming home from a party in Millbrook. I wasn't drunk, but I was tired. So tired. A chill ran down my spine. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white. Look, this isn't funny. I didn't see the curve coming," she continued as if I hadn't spoken. "Took it too fast. They said I died instantly when I hit that big oak tree. Small mercies, I suppose." My heart was pounding now. This had to be some kind of sick joke, right? A prank for one of those hidden camera shows? I looked around, half expecting to see camera crews hiding in the trees. "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm going to pull over now and you can get out." She turned to me then, and her eyes, God, her eyes. They were full of a sadness so deep it made my chest ache. "Please," she said, "I'm so close. I just want to go home one last time." I don't know why I didn't stop the car. Maybe it was the pleading in her voice or the fact that I was too scared to take my hands off the wheel. Or maybe deep down I was starting to believe her. "What's your name?" I asked, my mouth dry. "Emily," she said. "Emily Caston." The name tickled something in the back of my mind. I'd heard it before, but where? "How long—" I swallowed hard. "How long ago did you die?" Emily tilted her head, considering. "What year is it now?" 2024? She nodded slowly. 20 years then. It happened in 2004, June 17th. The date hit me like a punch to the gut. June 17th, 2004. I knew that date. Everyone who grew up in this area did. "The graduation night tragedy," I whispered. Emily smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Is that what they called it? Sounds so formal." I remembered now. It had been all over the local news when I was a kid. A young woman, fresh out of high school, killed in a car accident on her graduation night. The whole town had mourned. There had been memorials, candlelight vigils. They'd even named a scholarship after her. But how? I gestured helplessly at her, solid and real in my passenger seat. "How are you here?" She shrugged, a surprisingly human gesture for a ghost. "I don't know. Most of the time I'm not, but sometimes on nights like this, when the veil is thin, I can come back, for a little while." I drove on autopilot, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. And yet I couldn't deny the evidence of my own eyes. The girl next to me in her outdated dress, dry despite the rain, with eyes that had seen things no living person should. "Why me?" I finally asked. "Why did you choose my car?" Emily looked at me, really looked at me for the first time. "I didn't," she said simply. "You chose to stop. Most people don't." We lapsed into silence after that. What do you say to a ghost? To someone who died before smartphones were a thing, before social media took over our lives? I had 1,000 questions, but they all seemed inadequate in the face of her quiet presence. As we neared Ashton, Emily began to get restless. She leaned forward, peering out the windshield. "It's changed so much," she murmured. "And yet not at all." I followed her directions, turning off the main road onto a quiet residential street. The houses here were older, stately things with big yards and ancient trees. Emily pointed to a 2-story colonial with blue shutters. "That's it," she said. "That's my house." I pulled up to the curb, killing the engine. The rain had finally let up, leaving everything draped in a fine mist. The house loomed before us, dark and silent. Emily made no move to get out. She just sat there, staring at her childhood home with an expression of such longing it made my throat tight. "Do you want to go in?" I asked hesitantly. She shook her head. "I can't. This is as far as I can go." She turned to me, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Thank you for bringing me home one last time." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Emily reached out and touched my hand. Her fingers were ice cold. "Can I ask you a favor?" "Of course," I said. "Live," she said simply. "Really live. Don't waste a single moment, because you never know when it might be your last ride." I blinked, and she was gone. The passenger seat was empty, as if she had never been there at all. But the chill of her touch lingered on my skin, and her words echoed in my mind. I sat there for a long time, staring at the house where Emily Caston had grown up, where she should have grown old. Eventually, I started the car and drove to my hotel, my head spinning with everything that had happened. The next morning, I called the client and postponed the photo shoot. Instead, I went to the local library and spent hours poring over old newspapers and yearbooks. I found her, Emily Caston, smiling out from her senior portrait, forever 18. I read about her death, about the grief that had rocked this small town, and I made a decision. I stayed in Ashton for a week, photographing the town, its people, its hidden corners. I captured the old oak tree where Emily had died, now surrounded by weather-worn teddy bears and faded flowers. I photographed her house, the high school she had attended, the places she would have known. When I was done, I put together an exhibition. The Last Ride, a portrait of Emily Caston in Ashton. It opened exactly 20 years after her death. The whole town came out for it. Emily's parents were there, older now, but still carrying the weight of their loss. They hugged me, thanking me for remembering their daughter, for bringing her story to life. I never told anyone about that rainy night drive. Who would believe me? But as I stood in that gallery, surrounded by images of a life cut short and a town forever changed, I could almost feel Emily there, watching, smiling. And I knew that I would keep my promise to her. I would live, really live, because every ride could be our last, and there are some hitchhikers you never forget. The warehouse loomed before me, a hulking shadow against the setting sun. No lights, no movement, no sign of life, but my manifest was clear. Delivered at 1255 Harbor Industrial Way, Oakland, California. As I pulled up to the loading dock, a chill ran down my spine. 20 years on the road, and I'd never seen a place so dead. I'm Jake Holloway, long-haul trucker. I've crisscrossed this country more times than I can count, seen just about everything there is to see from behind the wheel of my Peterbilt. But this was different. It started like any other job. Pick up a load in Seattle, deliver it to Oakland. Simple. The manifest listed it as electronic components, which usually means a boring haul of circuit boards or computer parts. Nothing to write home about. The first sign that something was off came when I tried to call the receiving number on my paperwork. Disconnected. Okay, not too unusual. Companies change numbers all the time, right? But then I couldn't find any current info on the company online. Microtech Solutions seemed to have vanished into thin air. Still, I had a job to do. So I made my way through Oakland's maze of industrial parks, following my GPS to the address. With each turn, the surroundings got more desolate. Abandoned buildings, overgrown lots, rusted chain-link fences, the kind of place that makes you check your locks twice. And then I saw it. 1255 Harbor Industrial Way. A massive warehouse easily the size of a football field, surrounded by a tall fence topped with barbed wire. The gate was padlocked, a thick chain wound through its links. I sat in my cab for a good 5 minutes, engine idling, just staring at the place. Every instinct told me to turn around, to call dispatch and tell them there must be some mistake. But I've never not completed a delivery. It's a point of pride. So I did what any self-respecting trucker would do. I honked, long and loud, the sound echoing off the empty buildings around me. Nothing, not a flicker of movement, not a single sign that anyone had heard. I climbed down from the cab, the gravel crunching under my boots. The air was thick with the smell of salt and rust, the nearby bay mixing with decades of industrial decay. I approached the gate, half expecting alarms to start blaring or guard dogs to come running. But there was nothing. Just silence. The padlock on the gate was old, covered in a fine layer of rust. It clearly hadn't been opened in years. I gave it a half-hearted tug, more out of obligation than any real hope. To my shock, it came off in my hand. I stood there for a moment, staring at the lock. This had to be a mistake. Maybe I had the wrong address. But no. The faded numbers on the building matched my paperwork exactly. Against my better judgment, I pushed the gate open. It swung inward with a groan that set my teeth on edge. I walked back to my truck and eased it through the gate, pulling up to the loading dock. The large roll-up door was shut tight, no signs or markings of any kind. Just blank, weathered metal. I climbed out again, flashlight in hand. The sun had dipped below the horizon now, leaving everything in deep twilight. I swept the beam across the building, looking for any sign of recent activity. Nothing. There was a smaller door next to the loading dock, probably an office entrance. I tried the handle, not really expecting anything. It opened. The hinges protested loudly as if they hadn't been used in ages. I shone my flashlight inside, revealing a dusty reception area. Old desks, ancient-looking computers, chairs draped in sheets. It looked like something out of a post-apocalyptic movie. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the cavernous space. "Anyone here? I've got a delivery from Microtech Solutions." The only response was my own echo. I should have left then. Should have locked everything back up, called dispatch, and gotten the hell out of there. But curiosity got the better of me. 20 years of routine deliveries, and suddenly I had a mystery on my hands. I made my way deeper into the building, my flashlight beam catching motes of dust swirling in the air. Everything looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. Half-empty coffee mugs on desks, jackets still hanging on the backs of chairs. And then I saw the calendar. It was one of those big office calendars, still hanging on the wall. the kind with a different picture for each month. This one showed a sunny beach scene at odds with the gloom around me. The month displayed was June. The year, 1999. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the cool night air. This place hadn't just been abandoned recently, it had been empty for over 2 decades. I turned, ready to hightail it out of there, when something caught my eye. A faint glow coming from deeper in the warehouse. Every horror movie I'd ever seen flashed through my mind. This was the part where the idiot protagonist goes to investigate the strange light and gets himself killed. But I'm no movie character. I'm a trucker with a delivery to make and a mystery to solve. I followed the glow, weaving through rows of dusty shelves and abandoned equipment. As I got closer, I could make out a low hum, barely audible but growing louder with each step. And then I saw it. In the center of the warehouse floor was a circle of computers, all of them on, their screens casting an eerie blue glow. They were sleek modern machines, a stark contrast to the obsolete tech scattered throughout the rest of the building. I approached cautiously, my mind racing. Who had set this up? Why here, in this abandoned warehouse? And what did it have to do with my delivery? As I got closer, I could see that each screen was displaying lines of code, scrolling by faster than I could read. Not that I would have understood it anyway. I'm good with engines, not computers. In the center of the circle was a pedestal with a single USB port. I reached into my pocket, pulling out the small package I was supposed to deliver. It had been sealed when I picked it up, but now curiosity overcame caution. I tore it open. Inside was a single USB drive. My hand hovered over the pedestal. Every rational thought screamed at me to walk away, to forget this whole thing. But I'd come this far. I plugged in the drive. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the screens around me exploded with activity. The scrolling code accelerated, blurring into a solid blue glow. The hum grew louder, rising to a pitch that made my teeth ache. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The screens went dark. The hum cut off, leaving me in total silence. A single word appeared on the center screen. Delivered. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. What had I delivered? To whom? And why all the secrecy? The sound of footsteps echoing through the warehouse snapped me back to reality. I turned, flashlight raised, half expecting to see men in black suits coming to disappear me. Instead, I saw a young woman. She couldn't have been more than 25, with short dark hair and intense eyes that reflected the glow of my flashlight. "You're late," she said, her voice matter-of-fact. I blinked, thrown off balance. "Late? Lady, I don't even know what I just delivered or who you are." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You delivered the future, Mr. Holloway, or perhaps the past. It depends on your perspective." "How do you know my name?" I demanded, taking a step back. She ignored my question. "Your job here is done. I suggest you leave now and forget everything you've seen, for your own safety." I'm not easily intimidated, but something in her tone made me pause. "What is all this?" I asked, gesturing to the computers. "What's going on here?" She sighed, as if disappointed by my curiosity. "Let's just say that some technology isn't meant for the present. Sometimes it needs to be incubated, hidden away until the world is ready for it." "And who decides when the world is ready?" I asked. Her smile turned cold. "People far above both our pay grades, Mr. Holloway. Now I won't ask again. Leave." I wanted to argue, to demand more answers, but the look in her eyes told me I'd get nothing more, and frankly, I wasn't sure I wanted to know. I made my way back through the warehouse, my mind reeling. As I climbed into my truck, I saw the woman standing in the doorway watching me. I had the unsettling feeling that this wouldn't be the last I'd see of her, or whatever operation she was part of. As I pulled away from 1255 Harbor Industrial Way, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The warehouse had disappeared, swallowed up by the night as if it had never existed. I drove in silence for a long time, trying to process everything I'd seen. Part of me wanted to report it, to call the cops or the FBI or someone. But who would believe me? And more importantly, would reporting it put me in danger? In the end, I did what truckers do best. I kept driving, kept my eyes on the road ahead, and tried not to think too hard about what I'd left behind. But sometimes, late at night when the highway stretches out empty before me, I wonder about hidden warehouses and secret technology, about deliveries that change the future, and about a young woman with old eyes guarding the past for a world not yet ready to receive it. One thing's for sure, I'll never look at a routine delivery the same way again, because you never know when your next stop might be your last stop, or the world's next big beginning.